China lent $182 billion to 49 African nations to build ports, railways, and telecom networks. The official line was development. But in Djibouti, one of those port projects flipped into a fortified PLA naval base in under 90 days, right beside America's only permanent African hub. That wasn't an anomaly. It was a blueprint. Chinese firms now hold stakes in 231 African ports, and the Pentagon is watching which one converts next. Officially, the numbers read like a development success story. From 2000 to 2023, Chinese banks, led by the Export-Import Bank of China and China Development Bank, signed off on 1,306 loans to 49 African governments, totaling $182.28 billion. The high watermark came in 2016, when new commitments spiked to $28.4 billion. But behind the headlines, the fine print tells a different story. Over 83% of this money flowed from China's two main policy banks, institutions that answer directly to Beijing's state planners, not commercial profit, but strategic calculus. The funds poured into hard assets, railways, highways, deep-water ports, dams, and telecom grids. But every loan came with strings. Contracts routinely required a Chinese state-owned enterprise to serve as primary contractor, and in many cases to provide the financing itself. Some deals mandated that up to 80% of equipment and materials be sourced from Chinese suppliers. Others bundled technology transfer or training, but kept core systems under Chinese control. This was not just about building infrastructure, it was about building dependence. The repayment arc reveals how that dependence locks in. Between 2010 and 2014, African governments received nearly $30 billion in new Chinese credit. From 2020 to 2024, those same governments were sending $22 billion back in repayments, including interest, principal, and renegotiation costs. The cash flow reversed, but the leverage remained. With every loan, Beijing embedded contractual levers, default triggers, asset seizure clauses, and in select cases provisions that allow for strategic cooperation or security support at Chinese-built facilities. These are not just financial instruments, they are blueprints for influence, ready to be activated when the time is right. Djibouti's Doraleh port stands as the purest example of China's commercial to military playbook in Africa. On paper, it began as a $560 million infrastructure project, a joint venture between China Merchants Port Holdings and the Djibouti government designed to boost trade and regional logistics. But the real story unfolded in the fine print and the construction schedule. Within days of Djibouti stripping Dubai's DP World of its long-term concession, CM Port engineers moved in, backed by a loan from China's Export-Import Bank that tied the project's fate to Beijing's state planners. Arbitration courts in London would later order Djibouti to pay over $500 million in damages for breaching its deal with DP World, but the financial penalty did little to slow the transformation already underway on the ground. Satellite imagery from late 2017 reveals how quickly the civilian facade gave way to military realities. In less than 90 days, the People's Liberation Army had erected a fortified base just across the fence line, complete with a deep-water pier, radar arrays, and hardened fuel depots. Officially, the site was labelled a logistics support facility for anti-piracy patrols. In practice, it became a modern fortress, with reinforced quays capable of berthing Chinese destroyers and a footprint that sits barely 3 kilometers from America's Camp Lemonnier. The speed and precision of the conversion left little doubt about intent. Construction teams, legal teams, and military planners worked in lockstep, turning a commercial port into a dual-use outpost in under 3 months. The Doraleh blueprint is now embedded in China's overseas infrastructure contracts, a civilian project, a debt-backed concession, and a rapid military build-out, all executed before the headlines catch up. What does not make the headlines is the pattern that Djibouti reveals. The question is not whether this model can be repeated, but how many times it already has, hidden in plain sight across the continent's port network. On the surface, Africa's port boom looks like a story of trade and development, but the numbers tell a different story. Chinese state-owned enterprises now hold direct or indirect stakes in 231 ports across the continent, more than any other foreign actor by an order of magnitude. These are not just scattered investments, they form a dense network stretching from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean, from Lagos and Luanda to Mombasa and Durban. Each node is linked by contracts that often run for decades, with operational control or long-term equity quietly shifting to Chinese hands. Publicly, these deals are about boosting capacity and easing congestion. The fine print, though, reveals a pattern of redundancy and logistical reach that goes far beyond commercial logic. In many cases, port concession agreements include clauses for strategic cooperation, security support, or priority access that remain dormant until they are needed. At Bagamoyo in Tanzania, Lekki in Nigeria, and Lobito in Angola, the language is explicit. Chinese naval vessels may refuel, resupply, or conduct maintenance with minimal notice, subject only to host country approval. These are not one-off exceptions. They are part of a systematic template. The scale is hard to overstate. With 231 sites mapped across 32 nations, China has built a lattice of access points that can be activated for military logistics, intelligence gathering, or rapid deployment. No single port, is indispensable. The strength lies in the network's redundancy. If one node is compromised, dozens of alternatives remain on call. What does not make the headlines is how these commercial contracts, signed in the name of development, have quietly transformed Africa's coastline into a series of latent forward operating bases, each one a potential lever of hard power, waiting for the right moment. Pentagon analysts now keep a classified list of 21 African countries flagged as candidates for future Chinese military bases. The list itself remains sealed, but details have surfaced in congressional hearings and AFRICOM briefings. Angola, Kenya, Mozambique, Namibia, Nigeria, and Tanzania all appear on the radar. But one name stands out, not for its size or military tradition, but for its location and the scale of Chinese activity: Gabon. Gabon has become the test case for China's Atlantic ambitions. In 2022, Beijing pledged €4.3 billion in an investment package for railways, mining, and, crucially, a deep-water port at Libreville. Within months, the Chinese hospital ship Peace Ark made a high-profile visit, docking at the new quay and hosting Gabonese officials for what was billed as a humanitarian mission. But satellite imagery from mid-2024 tells a less benign story: a reinforced berth, breakwater extensions, and a concrete pad large enough for a People's Liberation Army Navy frigate. The construction aligns with the technical requirements for People's Liberation Army Navy deployments, not just commercial shipping. The Gabonese government insists these are public-private partnerships, while Chinese diplomats describe the upgrades as routine infrastructure support. Yet the contract language echoes the same logistics support facility phrasing used in Djibouti. Pentagon planners see a familiar pattern: first the loans, then the port, then the visit by a naval vessel, and finally the arrival of military-grade infrastructure, always under the cover of development. If activated, a Gabon base would give China direct access to the Atlantic oil lanes that carry more than 4 million barrels a day to Europe and the Americas. For Washington, the prospect is clear. The Djibouti blueprint is now being tested on the Atlantic, and the window to prevent a second Chinese base may be closing fast. On paper, China's presence in Africa often looks like a patchwork of United Nations peacekeeping missions, training seminars, telecom upgrades, and resource investments, but each of these levers fits into a larger, tightly coordinated web. Roughly 2,000 Chinese troops rotate through United Nations peacekeeping operations across Mali, South Sudan, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, ostensibly under United Nations command, but always answering to Beijing's chain of authority. Behind the uniforms, more than 6,000 African officers have been trained in Chinese military academies since 2010, returning home with doctrine and tactics aligned with the People's Liberation Army. Arms deals, including drones, air defense systems, and electronic warfare kits, are bundled with long-term financing, locking militaries into Chinese supply chains. Meanwhile, Huawei has built the digital backbone in at least 5 African capitals, controlling 5G core nodes and cloud servers. And at the mineral level, Chinese state firms have sunk $4.5 billion into lithium projects, securing a third of global output. Each layer, troops, training, networks, and minerals, reinforces the last, creating a system where commercial, digital, and military dependencies overlap by design. Camp Lemonnier stands as the United States' only major military base on the African continent. A lone fortress in Djibouti, hemmed in by the same energy corridors that move over 20 million barrels of oil a day through the Bab el-Mandeb and Suez. While Chinese financing in Africa now routinely tops $20 billion a year, US foreign assistance lags far behind at just $8 billion. The gap is not only financial. With a single fixed hub, the American posture relies on predictable supply lines and overflight rights that can be disrupted or surveilled. General Stephen Townsend, former AFRICOM commander, warned Congress that a Chinese Atlantic base would significantly erode US freedom of navigation. That is a risk not just to military mobility, but to the energy security of entire continents. In this environment, every new Chinese port stake is more than a commercial outpost. It is a potential counterweight to America's exposed position. Every port, every training program, every telecom contract, each fits a pattern that is no longer theoretical. The Djibouti blueprint is now embedded in Africa's infrastructure. The question is not whether China can convert commercial leverage into military access, but whether anyone will recognize the shift before the next base is operational, before the network is too dense to unwind. With 231 ports mapped and the Gabon test case underway, the window for a meaningful response is narrowing. The uncomfortable reality is this: by the time the headlines catch up, the backup plan may already be in place. Commercial deals rarely make headlines, but 231 African ports now offer China ready-made leverage, each a potential switch from trade hub to military outpost. The real question is this: when economic presence becomes military reality, who decides the timeline? For every port, the clock is running. Drop your perspective in the comments.